What gives a government the right to tell you what to do? Not just whether it can arrest you, or tax you, or draft you, or pass laws over your head, but something deeper than that. What makes political authority legitimate in the first place? What gives a government the right to tell you what to do? Not just whether it can arrest you, or tax you, or draft you, or pass laws over your head, but something deeper than that. What makes political authority legitimate in the first place? That question is the center of one of the most influential books ever written on politics, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Social Contract, published in 1762. And Rousseau's answer is still shocking because he does not begin by asking how to make people obey. He begins by asking how people can remain free while living under laws. That is a very different question. Most political thinkers before him were focused on order, stability, and protection from chaos. Rousseau is asking, can political life be organized so that obedience does not destroy liberty? His answer is both inspiring and dangerous, which is exactly why people still argue about him. In this video, we are going to unpack Rousseau's social contract from the ground up. What problem he was trying to solve, what he meant by freedom, what the general will is supposed to be, why he thought legitimate political authority ought to come from the people, and why his ideas have been celebrated, misunderstood, admired, and feared ever since. And along the way, we will also see why Rousseau's work is not just a philosophy book. It is a blueprint for modern democracy, a critique of inequality, and one of the most controversial attempts ever made to reconcile authority and liberty. So let's start with the basic problem. By the 18th century, Europe was full of kings, empires, aristocracies, and inherited privilege. Political power usually came from tradition, conquest, religion, or birth. If you were ruled, it was because someone above you said that was the natural order of things. Rousseau was deeply suspicious of all that. He thought people had become too comfortable accepting inequality as if it were natural. He thought society often trained people to admire wealth, status, and power, while quietly teaching them to forget what genuine freedom looked like. Now, Rousseau was not the first to talk about a social contract. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke had already done that before him, but Rousseau uses the idea differently. Hobbes said that without government, life would be violent and insecure, so people agreed to surrender power to a sovereign in exchange for peace. Locke said, people have natural rights, and governments exist to protect those rights, especially life, liberty, and property. Rousseau agrees that politics should be based on agreement, not divine right, but he thinks both Hobbes and Locke still miss something crucial. For Rousseau, the deepest question is not simply how do we protect ourselves? It is how do human beings remain morally and politically free in a society that inevitably constrains them? That is the tension at the heart of this philosophy. Because once you live with other people, you cannot just do whatever you want. Your desires clash with other people's desires. Your freedom bumps into their freedom. Rules become necessary. Laws become unavoidable. The question is whether those laws are something imposed from outside or something that expresses a will shared by the people themselves. That is Rousseau's ideal. And to get there, he starts with one of the most famous lines in political philosophy. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. That sentence is so famous because it sounds simple, but it is not just a slogan. It is the core of the entire book. What does it mean? It does not mean human beings are literally born into a perfect natural freedom that society ruins in every sense. Rousseau is not saying we should all go live in forests and abandon civilization. What he means is that human beings have a natural capacity for independence, self direction, and moral agency, and modern society often damages that capacity by turning people into dependents, rivals, and performers. In other words, the chains Rousseau is talking about are not just literal political chains, they are also social chains. Status, anxiety, domination, inequality, vanity, and dependence on the opinions of others. That is why he thinks politics cannot just be about force, it has to be about legitimacy. A society is not truly just because it is strong, it is not truly stable because it is old, it is not truly rightful because a king says so. It is legitimate only if the people living under it can regard themselves as authors of the laws they obey. That idea is the foundation of the social contract. To understand Rousseau, we need to understand the state of nature. This is a philosophical thought experiment. It is not a historical claim that there was once a perfect prehistoric period we can recover with archaeology. Rousseau is imagining what human beings are like before complex society, property, hierarchy, and institutions reshape them. And unlike Hobbes, Rousseau does not think the state of nature is a war of all against all. He does not imagine early human life as constant brutal conflict. He thinks natural human beings are more solitary, peaceful, and limited in their desires. Rousseau believes the earliest humans are driven by two basic impulses. The first is self preservation. People want to survive, they want food, safety, and shelter. The second is pity, sometimes translated as compassion or natural sympathy. Human beings are not naturally monsters, they are capable of feeling for the suffering of others. That matters a lot because Rousseau thinks social corruption does not begin with pure evil. It begins when comparison enters the picture. As society develops, people start measuring themselves against others. They become aware of status. They want recognition. They want to be admired. They want to appear superior. Rousseau calls this kind of socially manufactured self love amour propre. That is different from amour de soi, which is more like basic self love or natural self concern. Amour de soi is not unhealthy, it is just the ordinary instinct to preserve oneself. Amour propre, by contrast, is reactive and comparative. It depends on what other people think. It makes us needy, vain, competitive, and often miserable. This distinction is one of Rousseau's most important contributions, because once human beings become obsessed with comparison, society changes shape. People stop asking, what do I need to live well? And start asking, how do I rank? The result is vanity, jealousy, domination, and a culture where people are always trying to look richer, smarter, or more respectable than they really are. And that, Rousseau thinks, is one of the hidden engines of inequality. So the state of nature is not paradise. It is simply a condition in which humans are less corrupted by social comparison. They are freer in one sense, but also more limited. They do not yet have the full moral life that comes with living together. And that means the challenge is not to go back to nature, but to create a society that does not destroy the natural basis of human dignity. That is where the social contract comes in. Rousseau's central question is not, why do governments exist? Governments obviously exist. His question is, how can political authority be justified? He thinks there are only a few possible answers, and most of them fail. First, there is force, but force is not legitimacy. If someone points a gun at you, you may comply, but that does not create a moral right to rule. Rousseau is very clear on this point. Power is not the same thing as right. The fact that someone can dominate you does not mean they deserve to dominate you. Second, there is inheritance or tradition, but all customs are not automatically just. A society can be ancient and still be corrupt. Third, there is divine right, but Rousseau does not accept that political authority comes from God in any simple, unquestionable sense. So, what is left? Consent. But Rousseau does not mean consent in the shallow sense of signing a paper once and then disappearing. He means a deeper civic agreement in which individuals unite to form a political community. By entering the social contract, each person gives themselves to the whole community and in return gains the protections and moral benefits of civil society. The famous formula is that each person gives themselves entirely to the community under conditions where everyone does the same. This is crucial. No one gets special status. No one stands above the rest as a master. The contract must be mutual and equal, or it is not a contract at all. That is why Rousseau says people are not surrendering freedom to a ruler. They are creating a collective political body. And this political body is what he calls the sovereign. Now, this is one of those Rousseau ideas that people often misread. When he says sovereign, he does not mean a king. He means the collective people, considered as a body capable of making laws for itself. That is a major shift. In older political theory, sovereignty usually sits somewhere above the people. In Rousseau, sovereignty belongs to the people themselves. They are not merely subjects, they are citizens. They are both authors and obeyers of the laws. That is the ideal, but it only works if the laws express a common good rather than private interests. And that takes us to one of the hardest and most controversial parts of Rousseau's system, the general will. The phrase general will has caused endless confusion. A lot of people hear it and assume Rousseau means whatever the majority wants. That is not quite right. He also does not mean the average of individual preferences. He does not mean polling people and counting up opinions like votes in a consumer survey. The general will is the will directed toward the common good. That sounds abstract, so let's make it concrete. Imagine a city where every citizen wants roads, safety, clean water, and fair laws, but many people also want tax breaks for themselves, favors for their group, special exemptions, and advantages over competitors. The will of all would be the sum of these private wants. The general will would be what remains when you ask what policy is best for the community as a whole, not just for a fraction. Rousseau thinks a legitimate law must reflect the common interest. This is why he is so suspicious of factions, parties, and special interest groups. He thinks they distort the political process by turning collective decision making into competition among private wills. In that sense, Rousseau is trying to solve a profound democratic problem. How do you govern a society made of different people with different interests without letting public life become a battleground of selfishness? His answer is not that everyone magically agrees on everything. His answer is that when citizens deliberate properly, they can identify laws that serve all of them as members of a shared political whole. That is the general will. But there is a catch. The general will is not simply the will of the majority. A majority can be wrong, a majority can be manipulated, a majority can be selfish. So Rousseau is not saying numerical victory automatically equals justice. At the same time, he is also not saying that one wise ruler should determine the common good for everyone. That would destroy the people's sovereignty. The general will must come from the people themselves, though it may require political institutions, civic education, and wise lawgivers to help citizens see beyond their immediate private interests. This is where Rousseau becomes both brilliant and dangerous. Brilliant because he is trying to articulate a form of democratic legitimacy deeper than simple voting. Dangerous because once you believe there is a single true common good, it becomes tempting for leaders to claim they know what the people really want better than the people do themselves. And history has shown that this idea can be used in very different ways. But before we get to the dangers, we need to understand Rousseau's notion of freedom, because this is where his whole argument becomes most distinctive. Rousseau does not think freedom means doing whatever you feel like. What kind of freedom is just appetite without structure? It is impulse, not autonomy. For Rousseau, there is a higher kind of freedom, civil freedom. This is the freedom that comes from living under laws you have prescribed to yourself as part of a political community. That is a strange idea at first. How can obeying laws be freedom? Rousseau's answer is that if you are subject only to your own private desires, you are not really self governing. You are being ruled by impulse, instinct, appetite, or even social pressure. True freedom is not the absence of all restraint, it is participation in a moral order you can recognize as your own. This is one of Rousseau's deepest arguments, and it has influenced a huge amount of later political thought. The point is not that laws are good because they restrict us. The point is that laws are good when they express a collective decision that all citizens can regard as binding on themselves, because they are part of a sovereign body that made them. In that case, obeying the law is not the same as submitting to someone else's will. It is obeying a public will in which you participate as a citizen. Rousseau says something even more radical. By entering the social contract, people may actually gain more freedom, not less. How? Because in the state of nature, your freedom is precarious. You can do many things, but you lack security. In civil society, by contrast, you gain legal protection, moral status, and a stable public world. Your freedom is no longer just raw independence, it becomes civic freedom, the ability to live as a member of a political community with rights, duties, and equal standing under law. That means the social contract transforms human life. It turns isolated individuals into citizens. But this transformation only works if the laws are truly general. A law must apply to everyone or to no one. It cannot be a private favor distinguished as public policy. A law must apply to everyone or to no one. It cannot be a private favor disguised as public policy. It cannot be written to benefit one class, one faction, or one person. A legitimate law is general in both its forms and its purpose. That principle is essential to Rousseau's politics, because once laws become instruments of private power, the social contract begins to decay. The state stops being a community of citizens and turns into a machine of domination. And then people are no longer free, they are merely managed. At this point, Rousseau introduces one of the most fascinating figures in the book, the legislator. This is not the same as the sovereign. The sovereign is the people collectively. The legislator is a special founder or political architect who helps establish the basic laws and institutions of a state. But Rousseau gives this figure an almost mythic quality. Why? Because founding a good political order is incredibly difficult. People are not blank slates, they have habits, prejudices, desires, and fears. A founding lawgiver must shape institutions in such a way that people can eventually become good citizens. But the legislator cannot simply command obedience by force, because the law is supposed to be legitimate from the start. So Rousseau imagines a genius founder who understands human nature and political design so well that he can guide a people toward freedom without ruling them. This is a strange and powerful idea. It reflects Rousseau's belief that institutions matter enormously. People are formed by the structures around them. Laws do not just regulate behavior, they shape character. If you build the wrong institutions, you produce selfish, dependent, corrupt citizens. If you build the right ones, you help produce a free people, capable of sustaining a republic. Rousseau was not naive about this. In fact, he is deeply aware that good politics requires more than good intentions. It requires civic architecture, rituals, education, law, symbolism, and sometimes even religion. That leads us to another of the most controversial parts of the book: civil religion. Rousseau was not writing in a vacuum. In his world, religion and politics were tightly connected. Churches could support kings, divide citizens, and compete with the state of authority. Rousseau wanted a political order that would not be torn apart by sectarian conflict. He thought the state needed a minimal civic faith, something like a shared moral framework that would support loyalty to the community. This is what he calls civil religion. He is not talking about a full theology or a state church in the traditional sense. He is talking about basic beliefs that help sustain civic life: belief in the sanctity of the social contract, respect for the laws, and a moral commitment to the community. At the same time, Rousseau was suspicious of religions that split citizens into competing loyalties. If your highest allegiance is to an institution outside the political community, then the state may struggle to function. Likewise, if the state tries to control religion too completely, it becomes tyrannical. So Rousseau is looking for balance. He wants religion to support civic unity without becoming a tool of domination. That balance is difficult, and in practice it has often failed. But the reason Rousseau cares about it is consistent with his whole theory. Politics is not just about administration, it is about forming people. A republic requires shared values. It requires citizens who can think beyond private interests. It requires some sense that public life is meaningful. Without that, the social contract becomes thin and fragile. Now we have to step back and talk about one of Rousseau's biggest concerns: inequality. Rousseau is famous for arguing that social inequality is not simply natural, it is produced. It grows through property, comparison, institutions, and social convention. He does not say all inequality is the same. Some inequalities may be necessary or unavoidable, but he thinks the most destructive inequalities are those that make some people dependent on others. When one person has power over another's livelihood, dignity, or survival, freedom becomes compromised. Property is especially important here. Rousseau does not say private property should be abolished in the modern socialist sense, but he does argue that property is one of the major foundations of civil inequality. Once some people own a great deal and others own very little, social relationships become distorted. Wealth buys influence, influence shapes law, law protects wealth. The cycle reinforces itself. Rousseau sees a political problem here, but also a psychological one. Property fuels comparison, comparison fuels vanity, vanity fuels dependence on opinion, and dependence on opinion makes people perform rather than live authentically. This is why Rousseau is so sensitive to appearances. Modern society for him is a theater. People constantly act for one another. They try to seem refined, important, moral, successful, but this constant performance can hollow out the soul. That is not just a personal complaint, it is a political one. A society obsessed with display will struggle to generate sincere civic virtue. And civic virtue matters because citizens must be able to act for the common good, not just for private enrichment. So Rousseau's attack on inequality is not just about poverty, it is about the moral effects of domination and comparison. A society can be materially prosperous and still be politically corrupt if it trains people to see themselves and each other as tools, rivals, or objects of display. This helps explain why Rousseau's influence extends far beyond political theory. He became important to education, romanticism, feminism, nationalism, and modern critiques of consumer culture. But it also helps explain why he is so controversial, because once you say society is corrupting people, someone will ask, what kind of authority is needed to fix it? And that question leads directly into the criticisms of Rousseau. This is one of the most important questions anyone can ask about Rousseau. If the general will represents the common good, who decides what that common good is? If citizens disagree, who interprets the general will? If someone claims to speak for the people, how do we know they are not just imposing their own will under the banner of public virtue? These are not minor objections, they go to the heart of the theory, because Rousseau is trying to solve a social problem. Private interests can fracture a polity, but his solution can be misused if someone treats the general will as a blank check for political authority. This is why later critics accused Rousseau of paving the way for totalitarian politics. If the state claims to know the true interest of the people, then it may justify coercion in the name of freedom. That sounds paradoxical, but history has shown that paradoxes like that can become very real very quickly. Now, to be fair, Rousseau is not simply saying the state can do whatever it wants. He's very clear that sovereignty belongs to the people and laws must be general, but he does believe a properly constituted republic can demand a great deal from its citizens, and he does think people can be forced to be free, in the sense they can be compelled to obey laws they have collectively authored. That phrase is famous for a reason, and also infamous for a reason. At its best, it means if you try to defect from a legitimate public order while still enjoying its benefits, the community has a right to enforce the laws you helped create. At its worst, it can sound like, we know what freedom really means better than you do, so we are going to compel you for your own good. That is the tension. And it is one reason Rousseau remains so provocative. His theory is not simple liberal individualism. He does not put personal choice at the center of everything. He puts civic membership and the common good at the center. That makes him indispensable for thinking about democracy, but also dangerous if his concepts are treated loosely. So, the right way to read about Rousseau is neither as a saint of democracy nor as a proto dictator. He is a thinker, grappling with a real and an unresolved problem. How do we create a political order that is both legitimate and free? And the fact that his answer can be interpreted in multiple ways is part of why the book matters so much. To really understand Rousseau, it helps to compare him to Hobbes and Locke more directly. Hobbes thinks the natural condition of humanity is so insecure that people rationally give up freedom to an absolute sovereign in exchange for peace. The goal is order. Freedom is secondary. Locke thinks people have natural rights, including property rights, and government exists to preserve those rights. If the government violates them, the people may resist. Rousseau thinks both of these miss the deeper issue of political self rule. For Rousseau, authority is legitimate only if citizens collectively author the laws under which they live. This is more demanding than Hobbes because raw order is not enough. It is also different from Locke because Rousseau is not primarily defending pre political property rights, he is defending civic freedom. That means Rousseau is not just asking what the state should protect, he is asking what kind of human beings political life should produce. That is a huge difference. Hobbes wants peace, Locke wants rights, Rousseau wants a people capable of freedom. That is why Rousseau's politics are more demanding, more idealistic, and more unstable. He thinks a good republic requires civic education, strong moral commitment, and a relatively small, cohesive political community. He's not describing a mass liberal democracy with millions of strangers all following their private interests. He is imagining a republic where citizens can actually participate in public life and feel a common identity. This is another reason he often appeals to modern critics of liberal individualism. He reminds us that politics is not just a market of preferences, it is a shared life. Rousseau influenced a huge range of latter thinkers and movements. He shaped the language of modern democracy by insisting that legitimate authority must rest on the people. He influenced revolutionary politics, especially in France. He influenced education by emphasizing development experience and the formation of the child. He influenced Romanticism through his emphasis on authenticity, feeling, and the corruption of artificial society. He influenced critiques of inequality, modernity, and alienation. And he still matters because the problems he identified have not gone away. People still ask whether democracies are truly representative or just manipulated by elites. People still wonder whether laws serve the common good or special interests. People still worry that social media and consumer culture train us to live for appearances. People still debate whether freedom means private choice or collective self government. And people still struggle with the fact that individual liberty and social cohesion often pull against one another. Rousseau does not resolve these conflicts once and for all, but he names them with unusual force. He forces us to ask whether a society can be free if its citizens are economically unequal, politically passive, and psychologically dependent on status. He asks whether law can be something other than domination. He asks whether citizens can become authors of their own world. That is why his work still feels alive. So, what is Rousseau's social contract in the simplest possible terms? It is his attempt to show how people can come together under law without giving up freedom. Not freedom as isolation, not freedom as doing anything you want, but freedom as collective self rule. That requires a contract in which each person joins with others as an equal, forming a sovereign people whose laws express the common good. The general will is a political expression of that common good. Civil freedom is what individuals gain when they obey laws they have helped create. And the whole system depends on institutions, education, and civic virtue, strong enough to resist corruption by vanity, inequality, and faction. That is the dream. But Rousseau never let us forget the risk, because the same idea that a people can govern itself can also be twisted into the idea that someone else knows the people's true will better than the people do. And that is where Rousseau becomes one of the most disputed thinkers in modern political philosophy. He is not easy to summarize because he is not offering an easy theory. He is offering a challenge to think about freedom more deeply, a challenge to think about legitimacy more seriously, a challenge to ask not just who rules but on what grounds, and a challenge to imagine a society where the laws are not just obeyed but owned. That is the promise of the social contract, and that is why, more than 2.5 centuries later, we are still arguing about it. If you strip Rousseau down to one question, it is this: how do we live together without becoming less free? And that question is still as modern as it was in 1762. Because every time we argue about democracy, inequality, civic duty, public virtue, or what it means to govern ourselves, Rousseau is somewhere in the room. Not because he gives us a neat answer, but because he gives us a problem too important to ignore. Thanks for watching.